welcome to History House. I'm your host, Owen Delaney. Let's begin. Today we will be talking about one of the most important politicians of the early 20th century, and yet an individual who is largely unknown beyond his native country or states surrounding it. When I mention politicians of the early 20th century, figures like Teddy Roosevelt, an icon of American presidential history, might come to mind, or indeed the Big Three, the victors of the First World War, David Lloyd George, Woodrow Wilson, or George Clemenceau. In Ireland, people would point to Michael Collins or Eamon de Valera, and the rivalry between them, which in the popular imagination led to the Irish Civil War. Coming closer to the country in today's episode, Benito Mussolini, Italy's Prime Minister and dictator, is certainly well known, as is his regime, which allied with Nazi Germany during the Second World War, or Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the founder of the Republic of Turkey, who will be an important figure in today's episode. And yet neither Mussolini nor Ataturk are the main focus of episode 17, but rather Eleftherios Venizelos, who was Greece's Prime Minister on 7 occasions, 1910 to 1915, briefly again later in 1915, 1917 to 1920, briefly in 1924, 1928 to 1932, briefly again in 1932, and finally once more in 1933. It's a natural question to ask why I chose to do an episode on Venizelos, and this can be broken into 7 different reasons. Firstly, while I have made a number of episodes on Ottoman and Turkish history, and have written an academic article on Irish-Turkish relations in the early 1920s, I have not done the same with Greece, Turkey's western neighbour, which despite its size has, quote, punched above its weight in history, and who was often a rival of the Ottomans, and later the Turks, first in its incarnation as the Byzantine Empire, and later the Kingdom of Greece, and the Republic of Greece, as we know it today. Secondly, I have encountered a number of Greeks in my line of work as an English teacher, particularly as colleagues, and I felt that it would be nice for them to hear me cover an aspect of their history delivered with my insights and expertise as a trained historian, given that I have done the same with my Turkish colleagues. There is also the importance of Venizelos' actions in shaping not just the history of Greece, but also southeastern Europe and the Middle East, as well as beyond. We must not forget that Greece's historical importance was not just the classical period, and through monuments such as the Acropolis in Athens, or figures such as Alexander the Great, as important as these are, but also in the modern period too, in the time since the Greek Revolution of 1821. This episode aims to shed light on a part of this period, and one whose consequences continue to shape the region and geopolitical relations even today, and who are often wrapped in controversy and even bitterness. This leads me on to my final and perhaps most important reason for making this episode. In October of 2024, I visited both Greece and Turkey, travelling to the Greek cities of Athens and Thessaloniki, and the Turkish cities of Istanbul and Ankara. By visiting museums in both countries, I came to understand the real consequences of the period of the Greco-Turkish Wars of the 1910s and early 1920s, of which Venizelos was unquestionably the most important Greek politician of these years. In the official histories of both of these nations, the other country in question is often portrayed as an aggressor and responsible for atrocities, and this is told and retold in the museums of each respective state. While I, as a historian, do not doubt or question the real atrocities that took place during this time, I believe that what is often overlooked is the very real attempts at peace that both Prime Minister Venizelos of Greece and President Ataturk of Turkey would make in the late 1920s and early 1930s, something that is often left out of popular history and serves as an example for dialogue and reconciliation, even in the chaotic and often violent world of 2025. I will discuss this often overlooked aspect in more detail later on, as I'm sure you would like me to begin the episode properly. So, without any further ado, let's go, or as they say in Greece, Pame. Venizelos was born in 1864 in the village of Myrnes, a suburb located a few miles south of Chania in Crete. Crete during this period was not part of the Greek state, but rather an eyalet province of the Ottoman Empire. The Greek Revolution, which began in 1821, culminated in the London Protocol of 1830, in which a Greek state, first a provisional government and then a kingdom, would be established, and its territory would be confirmed as south of the cities of Arta and Volos in 1832. Crucially, Crete lay outside of this state, in spite of its Greek population, and would be a province of Egypt, a vassal of the Ottomans, and then a full Ottoman province from 1840. Venizelos was the fourth of 6 children in his immediate family, with 3 older siblings having died in infancy, and his family having a strong nationalist history. His father, Kyriakos Venizelos, was a merchant and an advocate of Crete's union with Greece, Enosis. His mother was Styliani Plamoudaki, and Venizelos' father faced confiscation of property and exile due to his nationalist activities as early as 1843. It is therefore fitting that Venizelos' name, Eleftherios, means the liberator or deliverer in Greek. In 1866, the Cretan revolt broke out, which would be suppressed 3 years later in 1869. While Kyriakos Venizelos initially disapproved of the rebellion, he would nonetheless be banished by the Ottoman authorities along with his family initially taking refuge in Cythera and later settling on the island of Syros, both part of the Kingdom of Greece, where Eleftherios received his first education. Following an amnesty in 1872, the family returned to Crete, and Venizelos attended local schools in Chania. During his 1 year at the secondary gymnasium at Chania, he studied Latin, ancient Greek, mathematics, French, and religious studies. The language of instruction here, and over the course of his education at school and university, was Katharevousa Greek, a literary language that was increasingly being used for official purposes and differed from the vernacular spoken by ordinary Greek speakers, Demotic Greek. Within the Greek state and Greek-speaking areas, knowledge of Katharevousa Greek was required both for career advancement and education, and as such, large swathes of the Greek population were excluded from both of these areas. Consequently, there was a political debate to replace the official language Katharevousa Greek with Demotic Greek, and this is something that Venizelos would wrestle with when he eventually became the Greek Prime Minister. In 1877, Venizelos left Crete at the age of 13 for mainland Greece, studying at the Lycée Antionadis and later attending the University of Athens, now the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens, from 1881 to 1887, where he studied law. His delay in finishing was brought about by the death of his father in 1883, in which Venizelos managed the family business, selling glassware for 2 years, before eventually selling the business and returning to Athens. In terms of influence in his future direction, it was here that students debated the political issues facing Greece and further instilled the desire for Venizelos of Crete uniting with the Greek state. Indeed, in 1886, Venizelos led a delegation of Cretan students to speak with British politician Joseph Chamberlain in Athens, discussing the island's desire for union with Greece. I briefly mentioned Joseph's son, Austin Chamberlain, in episode 5 about Lady Lavery as a British representative during the Anglo-Irish Treaty negotiations. In March of 1887, Venizelos returned to Chania, Crete, and began his career as a practicing lawyer, and later in 1887 he was elected to the Second Court of Appeal of Chania. In 1888 he was engaging in journalism and was the publisher-editor of the liberal newspaper Lefka Ori, White Mountains, which advocated for liberalism, reform and union with Greece. He would contribute views in weekly notes and leading articles signed as Lefkoritis, the man of the White Mountains, and in 1899 he was elected as a member of the Cretan Assembly and became the leader of the island's Liberal Party, beginning a decades-long political career. Venizelos' presence within Crete again would be short-lived, as in 1889 some members of the Cretan Assembly took a stand for union with Greece, and the Ottoman authorities decided to impose martial law on the island. While Venizelos was not part of this stand, he nonetheless felt compelled to leave Crete again and return to Athens for a period of exile. It was around this time that Venizelos became betrothed and married to Maria Eleftheriou Katelozou, born in 1870. She was the daughter of Sophocles Katelozos, a prosperous businessman in Crete who ran a trading company dealing in soaps and oils. He had known her from before this time in Athens, but upon completing his studies and returning to Crete, he began taking a serious interest in her, becoming betrothed in 1880 and married in December 1890. During Venizelos' exile and subsequent stay in Athens, the two maintained contact through an extensive correspondence, exchanging 96 letters. These letters reveal a deep emotional commitment, documenting their misery and melancholy during their separation, with Venizelos expressing a lyrical and romantic side, recalling happy moments of dancing and walking together, and stating that he had, quote, never been in love before. Upon his return from exile, the two began living together, and they had two sons, Kyriakos, born in 1892, and Sophocles, born in November 1894. Tragically, just 2 days after the birth of their second son, Sophocles, Maria died from perpetual fever. Venizelos was distraught, and he reportedly refused to see his newborn son for a period. As a result of his grief, Venizelos allowed his beard to grow, a feature he maintained for the rest of his life, and one of his most distinguishing features. In spite of such grief, life naturally goes on, and so did it do so for Venizelos. By the middle of the 1890s, he was no longer the advocate for a cautious approach to union with Greece, but rather a full revolutionary. While believing an 1895 rebellion to be ill-timed, he would set up a revolutionary headquarters on the Akrotiri Peninsula in 1897, a rebellion that would prompt a full-blown war between Greece and the Ottoman Empire. Greece itself was ill-prepared for this conflict, and as a result of the intervention from the great powers, the Ottoman Porte was forced to grant Crete autonomy rather than the full union that revolutionaries like Venizelos had sought. However, following an 1898 incident in which a, quote, band of Turks set on a detachment of British bluejackets and killed a number of them, together with the British vice-consul, in the words of Michael Llewellyn-Smith in his work Ionian Vision, Ottoman troops were evicted from the island and the great powers took control of Crete, with Prince George of Greece being appointed High Commissioner of the powers in Crete. As such, Crete was now independent of the Ottoman Empire in all but name. Venizelos, owing to his standing among those seeking union with Greece, was appointed to the 6-member Cretan Executive Committee, which acted as a provisional administration for the island, and within Prince George's 5-member cabinet, where he served as Councillor for Justice and Foreign Affairs. Although Venizelos would be instrumental in terms of reshaping the judicial system on the island, as well as being instrumental in terms of drafting an autonomous constitution, his relationship with Prince George became increasingly strained. The prince began to govern in an increasingly despotic manner, as Michael Llewellyn-Smith writes in his biography of Venizelos. Quote, he intended to govern Crete as if the island was a battleship, and he the captain, whatever the powers might think of the constitution with which they had endowed the island. End quote. Venizelos himself would eventually be dismissed from the cabinet in 1901, and a campaign of slander was launched against him, which he attempted to combat through his newspaper Kyrix, the Herald. Indeed, Archbishop Chiroudakis, a supporter of the prince, launched a libel suit against the newspaper, forcing it to close down, and Venizelos was sentenced to a fortnight's imprisonment. Eventually, things came to a head during the Thessaro Rebellion in 1906, led by Venizelos, which sought a union with Greece. While this did not happen, the intervention of the great powers forced Prince George's resignation and a humiliating departure for Greece. In his place, Alexandros Zymis, a previous and future Prime Minister of Greece, was appointed commissioner, someone who Venizelos got on with at the time, and for 2 years Crete's autonomy increased, with union with the Greek mainland becoming increasingly more likely. However, beginning in 1908, a series of events would compel Venizelos to return to Athens and to become the Prime Minister of Greece. In 1908, the Young Turk Revolution took place in the Ottoman Empire. In 1876, a constitution had been proclaimed for the Ottoman Empire, with scheduled elections for a Chamber of Deputies. After these took place in 1877, the constitution would be rescinded in 1878, with Sultan Abdul Hamid II essentially ruling by decree for the next 30 years. In 1908, sections of the Ottoman military revolted, forcing the Sultan to reinstate the 1876 constitution and to schedule elections. Given that Crete was still, de jure, part of the Ottoman Empire, deputies in Crete took the opportunity to declare a unilateral union with Greece, something that was not recognised internationally. The following year, in 1909, Greek army officers, inspired by the Turks, staged the Goudi coup, which overthrew the government. However, in order to govern effectively, they needed an outsider as Prime Minister, someone who wasn't tainted by the old government. When the officers couldn't agree on a suitable candidate for Prime Minister within Greece, they turned to a prominent Cretan politician whose revolutionary record was plain for all to see, Eleftherios Venizelos. Upon arriving back in Athens in January 1910, Venizelos skillfully negotiated with the Military League, the established political parties, and the king. He avoided the trap of immediate appointment as Prime Minister by the Military League, which would have made him their pawn, instead securing a mandate to negotiate a solution. King George I distrusted Venizelos due to his past conflict with Prince George, who was his son, and Venizelos attempted to reassure the king of his loyalty to the dynasty. Eventually the king relented when faced with a show of force arranged by the League at Venizelos' urging. Venizelos then successfully persuaded the Military League to dissolve itself in March 1910, ensuring that an election would take place. When an election in August failed to secure a majority for Venizelos and his supporters, another election would be called for October, in which his newly founded Liberal Party, Eleftherios, won 307 out of the 362 seats in the Parliament, albeit largely as a result of various opposition parties boycotting the election. Having been formally appointed as Prime Minister in October, Venizelos now had a large enough majority to enact a series of far-reaching reforms that dramatically changed the Greek state. During his first premiership, Venizelos and his cabinet enacted a staggering 337 new laws. These included revising the constitution in 1911 and furthering the independence of the judiciary, but also electoral reforms too. The age limit for deputies was lowered from 30 to 25, and members of the military elected to the parliament were forced to resign their positions before taking up their seats, demonstrating that Venizelos was now in control, not the military that helped bring him to power. A regulatory body was appointed to oversee the appointment and dismissal of civil servants, in an attempt to reduce political influence, and a Ministry of National Economy was established too. Public works were constructed, including the expansion of telegraph lines and post offices, and from 1910 to 1913 the national revenue increased by a third. Agrarian reforms were implemented in order to address the plight of small farmers, and trade unions were recognised through the creation of a national labour board, as well as health and regulations being established for the employment of women and minors. In the field of education, elementary education up to the 6th grade was made free and compulsory, and Venizelos also attempted to tackle the language issue that was mentioned earlier. He advocated an evolutionary approach where the two forms of Greek demotic and katharevousa would eventually converge, leading to the eventual disappearance of bilingualism. In terms of providing reassurance to the traditionalists, mainly the Greek Orthodox Church, he added a draft constitutional provision that strictly forbade translating the Holy Writ, Gospels, into any other lexical form without the approval of the Holy and Great Church of Christ in Constantinople. This was intended to remove the religious element from the language debate. On the other hand, Kathomelumene, a moderate form of Demotic, was introduced into primary school readers in 1913, marking the beginning of crucial educational reform. Another series of reforms was in relation to the military. For example, a French military mission led to a complete transformation of the Greek army, enabling Greece to put at least 200,000 soldiers off the first line into the field. On the other hand, a British naval mission in April 1911 under Admiral Lionel Tufnell was tasked with improving training, such as gunnery and signals, establishing a cadet school, and reorganising the Greek navy. Another mission, led by the Italians, assisted with reforming the gendarmerie. Venizelos also recreated the post of General Inspector of the Armed Forces, specifically for the Crown Prince Constantine in June 1911. This was important as Constantine had received German military training, which was regarded as the most skilled army in Europe at the time. These reforms would prove important, owing to the beginning of a series of conflicts that would engulf southeastern Europe at the beginning of the 1910s, the Balkan Wars. In 1911, a conflict between the Ottoman Empire and Italy revealed how military weak the former had become, and led to the ceding of Libya and the Dodecanese Islands to the Italian kingdom. As a consequence of this, Greece, along with Bulgaria, Serbia and Montenegro, came to the conclusion that they could gain territories from the quote, sick man of Europe, and the Balkan League was created in 1912. Jumping the gun, on the 8th of October 1912, Montenegro declared war on the Ottoman Empire, and following a rejection of an ultimatum from the Balkan League, Greece and Serbia intervened, with Greek troops crossing the northern border of Thessaly into Ottoman territory on the 18th of October. For all intents and purposes, the war was a disaster for the Ottoman Empire. Various islands in the Aegean would be seized by the Greek navy, and on the 8th of November, Greek forces led by Crown Prince Constantine took the port of Thessaloniki, one of the largest cities in the Ottoman Empire, and a place that would become the second largest city of Greece. Constantine would beat a Bulgarian division by less than 24 hours in terms of taking the city. There was a very real human cost to the war, in that more than 100,000 Muslim refugees would be displaced and would flood into Constantinople. This would also be followed by reprisals against Greeks in Anatolia, furthering the sense of bitterness between Greece and the Ottoman state. Alongside the doubling of Greek territory, Greece's population would also increase from 2.7 million to 4.8 million. Venizelos would also use the opportunity of the conflict to accept Cretan deputies to the Greek Parliament in October 1912, and with the signing of the Treaty of Athens in 1913, the union, enosis, between Greece and Crete was formally recognised. Bulgaria, unsatisfied with its gains during this conflict, launched a preemptive attack on Greece and Serbia, starting the Second Balkan War. Greece and Serbia and Montenegro would be joined by Romania and, ironically, the Ottoman Empire, and would defeat Bulgaria, with Greece receiving even more territory along the northern coast of the Aegean. Following the end of the Second Balkan War, Venizelos was at the height of his popularity. His reforms had led to his party once again winning an enormous majority in Parliament, as during the March 1912 election his party won 146 seats out of the available 181, even with the participation of opposition parties. Greece's acquisition of new territory, further, was also seen as validation of the megali idea, the great idea, the expansion of Greek territory at the expense of the Ottoman Empire in particular, with the eventual goal of retaking Constantinople and, in essence, recreating the Byzantine Empire. In addition to this, King George I of Greece had been assassinated on the 18th of March 1913 in Thessaloniki, and Constantine ascended the throne as King Constantine I, his name heralding back to Emperor Constantine I, the founder of the Byzantine Empire and Constantinople. Yet the relationship between monarch and prime minister would gradually become tense in the following years, owing to political events unfolding in Europe. As 1913 became 1914, war clouds continued to hang over the Balkans and Europe in general. World War I would prove consequential in terms of shaping the future direction of Greece, both politically and military during this period, and the shadow of Venizelos would loom large over the next 2 decades of Greek history. Before all this, though, we will have a short break with a rather unusual recording. Footage of Venizelos himself, as the Greek Prime Minister, speaking in English during a conference in The Hague in the Netherlands in 1929, just a few years after talkies were invented. This footage was not easy to get, and is unusual as it features an outtake at the very end, showing a human side to politicians in the 1920s that is often not seen, especially during this period. Laughing out loud upon realising that the cameraman wanted him to stop talking. So, I hope you enjoyed this brief clip of Venizelos speaking, and I'll see you all soon.
By the virtues of its administration and of its people, Holland stands as an example for small nations. From the international point of view, it has been one of the most important centers of international cooperation. The Palace of Peace was led at the gates of its capital, which is also the seat of the International High Court of Justice. In consequence, I think that the choice of The Hague as the siege of this conference is an excellent omen for its successful issue. I hope now that has finished.
Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the audio as it comes from a rare newsreel. I'll be honest, it wasn't easy to get, as it is only available from one university, so I am making the clip with footage available as a separate video on YouTube. So check it out there to get a real sense of the politician that was Eleftherios Venizelos. Before the break, I charted the meteoric rise of Venizelos, first in Crete, then in mainland Greece, his various reforms, and the Balkan Wars, which led to Greece doubling its territory. Now we will be looking at Venizelos' premiership during the First World War, the various threats he faced, along with the Greco-Turkish War after 1918, and the rather unexpected change in policy that Venizelos adopted following this conflict's aftermath. On the 28th of June 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and his wife Sophie were assassinated in Sarajevo in modern-day Bosnia and Herzegovina. The assassin was Gavrilo Princip, a Bosnian Serb, and, believing that Serbia had a hand in the assassination, the Austro-Hungarian Empire declared war on Serbia, I briefly talked about this in episode 15, which was about the Mayerling incident. Over the course of a month, and owing to various alliances, two blocs would emerge facing each other in the First World War. The Allies, of which the principal powers were Great Britain, France, and the Russian Empire, joined by Italy in 1915, and the Central Powers, the German Empire, Austro-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Greece would initially be neutral at the onset of the conflict, but an unease would develop between those who favoured the Allies and those who favoured continued neutrality, or even the Central Powers. Venizelos as Prime Minister increasingly favoured the Allies. Aside from understanding Britain's position as the leading naval and commercial power, with the ability to blockade Greece if it so desired, alongside fearing Bulgarian hegemony in the Balkans, it would become a central power, Venizelos was also motivated by the previously mentioned megaly idea. Given that the Ottoman Empire was one of the three leading central powers during this conflict, defeating it, with the support of the Allies, could lead Greece to further enlarge its territory and even secure Constantinople. However, Venizelos' desire to join the Allies was kept in check by King Constantine I. As mentioned before, Constantine travelled to Germany for his military training and was also made a field marshal in Potsdam in September 1913, along with receiving the Collar of the Black Eagle and a colonelcy of the 2nd Nassau Infantry Regiment. While these honours were largely ceremonial rather than having any real military attachment to Germany, it is obvious that the king had a very favourable attitude to the German Empire. However, the most obvious aspect of his pro-German sympathies lay in the fact that his wife, Queen Sophia, was the sister of Kaiser Wilhelm II. With two figures with divergent attitudes to World War I holding the levers of power in Greece, the choice of neutrality was a compromise, albeit an uneasy one, and over time these tensions would tear Greece apart into two entities, some would argue into a civil war. This is known in history as the National Schism. In January 1915, the Allies offered Greece important territorial concessions in Asia Minor, Ottoman territory, if it would join the war. Venizelos, convinced that this was a once-in-a-generation opportunity for national expansion, advocated accepting the offer and contributing a division to the Allied Expeditionary Force at Gallipoli. The king, backed by the General Staff, refused to sanction Venizelos' intervention plan. On the 6th of March 1915, the king overruled his prime minister, forcing Venizelos to resign. Following his resignation, Venizelos publicly voiced his disagreements with the tensions moving to the media and the public sphere. The Liberal Party, led by Venizelos, would win a general election on the 13th of June 1915, albeit with a reduced minority, and Venizelos once again became Prime Minister, and he had to once again deal with an increasingly incensed king. When Bulgaria mobilised its forces in September 1915, signalling its imminent entry into the war on the side of the Central Powers, Greece responded with its own general mobilisation. Venizelos would offer Greek troops to aid Serbia, citing the Greco-Serbian Defensive Treaty of 1913, but the anti-Venizelists, led by the king, argued that the treaty was intended to apply only to Balkan entanglements, not a general European war. King Constantine, who was commander-in-chief, quickly forced Venizelos to rescind his offer to the Allies, with Venizelos taking his case to Parliament and winning a vote of confidence on the 4th of October 1915. The following day, King Constantine dismissed him again, intensifying the constitutional crisis, which would be accompanied by Allied forces, British and French, landing in Thessaloniki in October 1915. The king was forced to call a new election in which Venizelos decided to boycott, on the grounds that it was unconstitutional and unfair under the laws of general mobilisation. Alongside the landings in Thessaloniki, the British and French began occupying strategic Greek islands and ports such as Corfu and Lemnos, as well as imposing a tight commercial and economic blockade on the area of Greece that continued to be controlled by royalist forces. Following this, in May 1916, the King's government complied with German demands and surrendered the Greek frontier fortress of Rupel to Germany's ally, Bulgaria. Citing its role as the protectors of Greece under the 1832 Treaty of Guarantee, signed in the aftermath of the Greek War of Independence, Britain and France demanded the demobilization of the Greek military, cementing the divisions further, and prompting the creation of a provisional government in Thessaloniki in August 1916, in which Venizelos would lead from October, and thrown his lot in with the Allied side officially. Civil war would erupt in Athens in December 1916, when Allied troops landed to seize arms and clashed with Royalist forces, forcing the surrender of the Royalist government, but not before the Archbishop of Athens excommunicated Venizelos. This act had huge implications owing to the deeply religious nature of society at the time, and ultimately prolonged this conflict. Eventually, it would come to an end in June 1917, when King Constantine I was forced to abdicate under increasing Allied military pressure in favour of his 23-year-old son, Alexander, who was seen as more malleable to Allied demands. Venizelos would return to Athens, and as Prime Minister, once again officially brought all of Greece to the side of the Allies. Nonetheless, the bitterness of this conflict would ensure that the tensions between the quote Venizelists and anti-Venizelists would continue for the years, even the decades that followed. In any case, with the formal declaration of war against the Central Powers on the 29th of June 1917, the Greek army joined the Allies in fighting Bulgaria on the northern border, and the navy would patrol the eastern Mediterranean Sea, escorting Allied shipping and taking out submarines. By July of 1918, the Greek army had swelled to 300,000 men, and would prove decisive in an offensive in September 1918 that broke the Bulgarian lines. Eventually, armistices would be signed with Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, and Greece in September, October, and November of 1918, respectively. Greece, as a member of the Allies, was a victor in the First World War, and as 1918 became 1919, Venizelos would have grand ambitions in terms of expanding Greek territory and fulfilling the Megali idea, particularly at the expense of the Ottoman Empire. Following the Armistice of Mudros on the 30th of October 1918, Ottoman participation in the First World War ended, with Allied troops proceeding to occupy the capital Constantinople and set about partitioning the Ottoman Empire. In the subsequent Paris Peace Conference, Venizelos presented detailed proposals for the dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire, aiming for the western section of Anatolia, bordering the Aegean, to go to Greece, including the city of Smyrna, now Izmir. Italy also had ambitions in this area, given that it controlled the neighbouring Dodecanese Islands. Yet the British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, and the American President, Woodrow Wilson, sought to limit Italian expansion, and on the 6th of May 1919, they, along with the French Prime Minister, Georges Clemenceau, casually gave the green light for a Greek occupation of Smyrna. On May 14th, 1919, Allied detachments landed to take possession of the Smyrna forts, and the next morning, May the 15th, the Greek army landed at Smyrna. While this was officially a provisional and peacekeeping intervention, both Venizelos and the Turkish population understood that the ultimate goal was annexation to the Greek state. After taking Smyrna, Greek troops began a gradual advance deeper into Anatolia, with reports of atrocities being committed being filtered through the front lines. These gains would be confirmed, along with the partitioning of the Ottoman Empire, with the Treaty of Sèvres, signed in August 1920, between the Allied powers and the Rump Ottoman state, which is now at the whim of the Allies. That being said, the situation on the ground remained fluid, with various Turkish nationalists coalescing into a united front, one that was based on loyalty not to a sultan, but rather to a Grand National Assembly, headquartered in Ankara in central Anatolia. Whereas the Ottoman Empire owed its name to its ruling dynasty, the House of Osman, this front attempted to further a unique Turkish identity and to take back as much of the territory that had been ceded in the aftermath of the First World War. The leader of this movement would be Mustafa Kemal, known to posterity as Ataturk, father of the Turks, a former Ottoman general who made a name for himself fighting against the Allies in the Gallipoli campaign. As such, there were two different root causes between the two countries in terms of the conflict. For Greece, it was the fulfillment of the Megali idea. For the Ankara government, a war of liberation, meaning that the name of this war is known by different titles in these two countries. In Greece, it is known as the Asian Minor Campaign. In Turkey, it is known as the Turkish War of Independence. This conflict would need an entire History House episode, or even two, to do it justice, so I won't relay all the details here, but rather link it with the life and career of Eleftherios Venizelos. 1920, in spite of the signing of the Treaty of Sèvres, was a difficult year for the Prime Minister of Greece. For one, an assassination attempt on Venizelos in Paris, 2 days after the signing of Sèvres, led to injuries on his shoulder and thigh, but nonetheless he survived. The second blow came in October with the death of King Alexander, in an odd twist as a result of a monkey bite that became infected. Gone was a malleable head of state, and in his place, Venizelos' rival, King Constantine I, returned from exile and reassumed the Greek throne. The final and most crippling blow came in the November 1920 general elections, when, in a surprise result, Venizelos' Liberal Party lost its majority and Venizelos was ousted as Prime Minister. While certainly surprising at the time, given the lofty ideals of the Megali idea, the most likely explanation could be that the Greek population was fed up with years of civil strife and war and wanted to return to a more peaceful state of affairs. Ironically, as 1920 became 1921 in the absence of Venizelos, the tide of war started to change. Greek forces were defeated by Turkish forces under Mustafa Kemal and his right-hand man, İsmet İnönü, a future Prime Minister and President of Turkey, at Sakarya in September 1921. One of the Greek commanders was Prince Andrew, the father of Prince Philip, the husband of the late Queen Elizabeth II. Further to this, the Treaty of Ankara, signed in October 1920, ended hostilities between France and the Turkish national movement, depriving Greece and the UK of an important ally. The US by this time was largely disinterested in this conflict and entering a period of isolationism. The battle lines between Greeks and Turks became stabilised into 1922, and finally in August 1922 the Turkish forces launched their Great Offensive, which captured Smyrna on the 9th of September. A few days later, after the capture of the city, a fire broke out which rapidly spread across Smyrna. Greek and Turkish historians dispute the cause of the fire, with a number of scholars believing it was deliberate, but regardless of this, the result was devastating, with an estimated death count of between 10,000 to 125,000 people, many of whom would be Greeks and Armenians. For the Greeks who arrived so triumphantly to Smyrna in 1919, their ambitions, and indeed the Megali idea, lay quite literally in ruins and ash. In Athens, chaos erupted. The evacuated Greek soldiers and officers would begin a march on the capital, seizing control, ousting the civilian government, and establishing a revolutionary government. While not formally holding the office of Prime Minister, Venizelos' influence in this new regime was apparent, in some ways a repeat of 1909 to 1910. King Constantine would be forced to abdicate a second time, handing the throne to his other son, King George II, before passing away from heart failure in Palermo, Italy, in January 1923. Needing a scapegoat for the military defeat in Anatolia, 9 military personnel and politicians of the previous government would be put on trial for treason, 6 of whom would be sentenced to death and subsequently executed in November 1922. The trial of the 6, as it became popularly known as, was highly controversial, and the British minister in Athens, Lindley, threatened to leave Greece which would have severed diplomatic relations. Indeed, the six would have their convictions overturned by the Greek court nearly a century later in 2010, but by then the defendants were long dead. Following the Greek defeat and the unwillingness of Britain's allies to support it in the event of war with the Turkish forces, the Chanak Crisis, a watershed moment in the development of political independence of British dominions, talks will begin to bring about a peace agreement between the Allies and the Turkish government. On the 24th of July 1923, in Lausanne, Switzerland, the Treaty of Lausanne was signed, paving the way for the establishment of the Republic of Turkey on the 29th of October, of which Mustafa Kemal would be its first president, and more or less established the modern borders of Turkey. I wrote an academic article about its unintended consequences for the newly established Irish Free State, and will be attaching the link to its Project Muse page in the episode description. But in terms of the most immediate consequences of this treaty was the massive population exchange between Greece and Turkey. All of a sudden, Muslims in Greece and Greeks in Turkey were expected to leave their homes and move to the neighbouring country, and it is estimated that in excess of 1 million people were expected to migrate. For some of these people, their homes were their family's home for generations, and this migration would add an enormous legacy of bitterness between the two countries. As a consequence of this, an uneasy but nonetheless stable peace now existed between Greece and Turkey. While Turkey would embark on a rapid programme of modernisation and secularisation under Mustafa Kemal, a period of instability would take place in Greece. The monarchy would be overthrown in 1924, only to be reinstated in 1935, and a series of 3 coups would take place in 1923, 1925 and 1926. Venizelos would wield power behind the scenes, and apart from a brief premiership in 1924, a longer and more stable term would take place between 1928 to 1932. Indeed, Venizelos' victory in the 1928 elections would be the largest electoral landslide in Greek political history, with his coalition winning 223 out of 250 seats, and in the words of the historian Roderick Beaton, this government would be, quote, the last stable elected government in Greece until the 1950s. Aside from a, quote, second golden age of Venizelism, with a number of reforms including the establishment of a social security system, Venizelos would also improve relations with countries such as Albania and Italy, including the signing of a treaty of friendship with Italy's dictator Mussolini in 1928. Of all his efforts to improve relations with his neighbours, though, the most important and surprising was with Greece's former enemy, Turkey. This rapprochement would appear from the lens of today as baffling, and even at the time could have been perceived as an act of political suicide on Venizelos' part. But there were some reasons as to why it took place. The decision to modernise the Turkish battleship Yavuz made Greece eager to de-escalate the situation and prevent an arms race, especially given the instability it had faced earlier in the decade. On top of this, Mussolini in Italy encouraged a rapprochement between the two countries, hoping to establish an alliance system across the Mediterranean, and in addition to all this, there were still some outstanding issues left unresolved following Lausanne, including issues of indemnity and the Greek Patriarch in Constantinople. Another issue that was not initially a source of common ground between Greece and Turkey was the issue of collective security in the Balkans, and in the 1930s the Balkan Pact would be established, which attempted to provide a common alliance system not just among Greece and Turkey, but also Yugoslavia and Romania, as a counterbalance to Italy and Greece's longtime foe, Bulgaria. The starting gun for this détente came in March 1930, when the Turkish ambassador to Greece, Enis Akaygen, decided to attend celebrations marking 100 years of Greek independence. With this, quote, breaking of the ice, the Ankara Agreement was signed in June 1930, which among resolving problems concerning Greeks and Turks, exempted from the population exchange, It also solved challenges regarding indemnity for estates and the Patriarchate, following Lausanne. Subsequent to this, Venizelos visited Ankara in October 1930. This visit, made on board a Greek warship, resulted in the signing of a comprehensive settlement, which was the Treaty of Friendship, Neutrality, Mediation and Arbitration, on the 30th of October 1930 in Ankara. This pact, achieved so quickly after decades of hostility, surprised many observers, and demonstrated the rejection of past conflicts. And during this period, Mustafa Kemal, soon to be Ataturk, would also order the immediate removal of a painting depicting a Turkish soldier bayoneting a Greek enemy at his residence in Ankara, calling it a, quote, revolting scene. The following year, in 1931, the Turkish Prime Minister, İsmet İnönü, returned Venizelos' visit and travelled to Athens. He was reportedly surprised by the warmth of his welcome in the Greek capital, although he clarified that the new friendship did not mean that Greek refugees would be able to return to Turkey, which was still a contentious issue for the Greek side. Even after the end of Venizelos' final premiership in 1933, relations remained friendly and continued to deepen. Panayotis Saldaris, Venizelos' successor, visited Ankara in September 1933, in which an Entente Cordiale was signed. Finally, a wider agreement was formalised on the 9th of February 1934, becoming the Balkan Pact, in which Yugoslavia, Romania, Greece and Turkey agreed to the mutual defence of each other's territory in the event of a conflict. In an extraordinary step in the friendship between the two countries, Venizelos even nominated Ataturk for the Nobel Peace Prize in 1934. Alongside this, Akaygen, now serving as the Turkish ambassador to Iran, was asked by the Greek government to represent Greek citizens in that country alongside Turkish citizens, because Greece did not have a diplomatic official there, something that would have been unthinkable a decade before. While this diplomatic friendship was almost miraculous in how it came about and praised internationally, economic problems at home would end Venizelos' popularity and bring about his final downfall. The Wall Street crash of 1929 and its economic consequences would hit Greece hard, and on the 25th of April 1932, Greece declared bankruptcy. An increasingly fragmented political environment would evolve, and after a brief premiership from June to November of 1932, Venizelos' final period as Prime Minister would begin in January 1933. He would lose the March 1933 election, and on the day after the election, Nikolaos Plasteras, a vigorous Liberal supporter and general, staged a military coup to overturn the result. Venizelos, while distancing himself from the attempt, was accused of involvement. Another failed assassination attempt of Venizelos would take place in June of 1933, and in 1935 Venizelos eventually gave his full support to a second coup attempt on the 1st of March 1935. This coup failed after a few days of fighting, with Venizelos fleeing the country. Venizelos would be tried and condemned to death in absentia, before dying in Paris a year later, in March of 1936, while in exile, a clear contrast to his earlier popularity and a somewhat anticlimactic end for someone who dominated Greek politics for the previous decades. The instability of Greek politics would continue to persist throughout the 1930s, until a sense of unity was achieved with resisting the Italian invasion of Greece in 1940 and later Nazi occupation from 1941 to 1944. Venizelos, as cliched as it sounds, was a figure of immense contrasts. On the one hand, his far-reaching reforms dramatically altered the fabric of the Greek state, as did the expansion of Greece's borders, particularly during the Balkan Wars. And yet, while Venizelos was at times immensely popular, as seen by his electoral victories, his habit of bending democracy at times to suit him, as well as his connections with the military, would certainly make many uneasy today, as it did during his time. On a personal note, The most striking element of Venizelos, in spite of his contrasts, was his willingness to engage in realpolitik, even if it meant improving relations with a one-time nemesis. My Greek-Turkish trip of 2024 had an immense effect on me, in particular regarding how each nation depicts each other in their popular history. In one museum in Athens, I recall an exhibition on the Treaty of Lausanne, which went to great lengths to portray the Turks as the greatest enemies of the Greek state. At the same time in Ankara, I remember seeing a monument to Ataturk, and yet not far away was a painting demonising Greeks in the context of the Turkish War of Independence, something that I believe he would have objected to, owing to his previously mentioned horror at a painting of a Turkish soldier killing a Greek one, and his message of Yorta Barish, Dunyada Barish, peace at home, peace in the world, which he proclaimed in 1931. And yet when I talked to individual people about people from the other country, they did not demonise the other, but rather showed respect. This leads me to believe that the demonisation of Turks in Greece, and vice versa, is largely the result of expedient politics, and scoring points to appease a vocal but nonetheless small minority of individuals who see their country exclusively through the lens of the past, while not also including the possibilities of the future. If both Venizelos and Ataturk, giants in the histories of their respective countries, could come to an understanding and forge a close partnership so soon after a devastating war and mass displacement, then why can't those today do the same, when the stain of history's sword has had time to heal over 100 years later? Before finishing this episode, I would like to make two announcements. Firstly, I will be including a link to an email sign-in sheet for those who want to receive the monthly History House newsletter. I will be releasing the first one on October the 1st, and it will include updates about upcoming episodes, plus some bonus material, so I hope you will sign up and hit the subscribe button if you like the episode. Secondly, the next episode will not be recorded in Ireland, but rather Mexico, as I will be talking about Mexico's Day of the Dead, the famous Mexican artist José Guadalupe Posada, and his most famous works, Calaveras. I might also be interviewing some Mexican friends too, so I hope you can join me for what promises to be an engaging and fascinating episode. And until next time, keep her lit.